Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Welcome to the Wolfman Chronicles, Book 6, Episode 73. Chapter 9, Werewolves and Demons, Achill Island, Ireland. The full moon hung high above Sleepmore Mountain, its pale light spilling over the deserted village like a ghostly tide. Shadows danced among the ruins as the wind swept through, carrying with it the mournful wail of the Atlantic crashing against the cliffs below. Earlier that afternoon, Jack and Sasha and the entire family had taken the trail up Sleepmore carrying supplies disguised as picnic gear. The men who would be staying behind knew it would be a long wait until midnight, so they brought extra sandwiches and bags to hide their clothing in when they did their transformation. Jack and Malachi had met earlier in the day and discussed their plan of action. Malachi was bringing 3 others and would arrive after dark, already transformed as wolves and taking an obscure path that looked more like a steep trail up the mountain. They would hide themselves behind the rocks where O'Malley had told Jack to hide. The afternoon had been uneventful, the kids playing amongst the ruins while the women sat on a blanket and watched their antics. They saw only 2 other people hiking the trail up to the deserted village and exchanged greetings with them. They were a young couple from Dublin, visiting just for the day. They took a few photographs of the ruins and they left, leaving Jack and the others alone on the mountain. And just before dusk, Sasha, Juanita, and Kat walked the kids back to the village, leaving the men to get ready for their long wait and whatever lay ahead. Sasha was relieved that Jack didn't need her to come. Though she was worried about his safety, along with the others, it eased her mind that he wasn't alone, though. Jack had Julian, Usko, Miguel, and Carl to help, and together, the pack seemed formidable enough to encounter any danger that the night might bring. And it was a cold, clear night, the kind that seemed to amplify every sound. The crunch of boots on frost-bitten grass, the rustle of clothing against the stone walls of the ruins. Even the quiet murmurs of conversation carried very far in this stillness. Jack and the others sat high above the ruins, nestled in a small group of tall rocks and bushes of gorse and heather. Now, just shortly after nightfall, several men walked up the path from the village to the graveyard. They were carrying shovels and pickaxes, various other implements used for digging. They were walking by the light of the moon rather than carrying lanterns or flashlights, and stumbled a few times on rock outcroppings as they navigated the path up to the graveyard and the ruins. Jack and the others watched as the men scattered in different directions, in groups of 2 or 3, and proceeded to begin digging around the graves. "Grave robbers?" Julian whispered. "We noticed a lot of fresh diggings the last time we were up here," Jack remarked in a voice low enough that no one other than Julian could hear. "We thought they were digging new graves, but it definitely looks like they're interested in something in those old ones." Suddenly, there came a whistle from one of the small gatherings of men. Several others stopped what they were doing and ran towards them. Soon there were 7 men digging in the same location, their shovels and their pickaxes making sounds that reverberated throughout the old stone ruins. Jack noticed one man kneeling over what looked to be an equipment box at the far back of the stone structures. He was attaching several wires to another box and cranking a lever on the side of the box. Jack squinted, struggling to see what the man was doing in the dim light from the moon. With 2 fingers, He motioned for Usko to look in the direction of the man kneeling over the box. After studying his movements for just a few moments, Usko whispered, "It looks like he's attaching cables to some kind of generator. Maybe for light? I don't know. It looks like he's got some kind of projector." Another whistle from the group of men, and everyone stopped what they were doing and put their shovels down on the ground, soundlessly. Knelt down low to the ground. All movements and sounds in the graveyard stopped. "Over there," Julian whispered, guiding everyone's eyes towards the right of the ruins and a little farther up the hill. It was difficult to make out the shapes at first, but as they came closer, it was obvious that it was 4 very large wolves. "Malachi," Jack whispered, "and his 3 friends. Someone down there has better eyesight than we do." Now, as the wolves drew near, the figures in the graveyard seemed to melt into the ground. From Jack's vantage point, he could still make out the man kneeling over the equipment box on the ground, hidden from the wolves' view behind what remained of a stone wall. The stillness almost felt suffocating as the massive wolves padded silently towards the ruins, their golden eyes scanning the area with unsettling precision. The pale moonlight gleamed off their dark fur, highlighting the sheer power of their movements. The wolves stopped suddenly, their noses lifted to the air as if catching a scent. One of them, a massive creature with fur so dark it almost seemed to absorb the moonlight, let out a low growl that rumbled through the stillness. That was Malachi. The other wolves fanned out slightly with deliberate movements and began circling the graveyard while Malachi stood by, observing the scene from his vantage point. The kneeling man finished plugging the last cable into his equipment, and a faint hum rose from the box. It was barely audible over the soft rustle of the wind, but Jack caught it, and so did the wolves. A flicker of blue light briefly illuminated the ruins as the projector powered on. Jack exchanged a glance with Usko, who gave a subtle nod and began creeping to the left, careful to stay low behind the rocks. He needed to get a little closer to gain a better view of what the kneeling man was up to. The hum grew louder, and the wolves reacted instantly. Malachi let out a sharp bark, and the other 3 froze in place, their ears flattening against their heads. The generator's lights grew brighter, and suddenly a wide beam of ghostly white projected against the side of the ruins, casting jagged shadows across the stones. The grave robbers didn't move. They remained low to the ground, as if they'd rehearsed this a million times. Then, from the edge of the projector's light, something began to emerge. At first, Jack thought it was smoke, a swirling, shifting mass that coalesced unnaturally. But as it moved farther into the beam, the shape began to solidify. Long skeletal limbs, a hunched frame, and a face that seemed to twist and writhe with impossible features. "What in the hell is that?" Carl's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. The wolves backed away slightly, their hackles rising as the creature stepped fully into view. It let out a guttural, bone-chilling sound, half growl, half scream, that sent shivers racing down Jack's spine. And now that he was closer, Usko could clearly see the man operating small levers on the box in front of him, and a small pinprick of light where the projector shone through a small chink in the stone wall. Instantly, the thought dawned on him. It's a hologram. Somehow this man was projecting a demonic-looking creature that seemed to have a life of its own. He watched as the man appeared to use something like a remote to control the movements of the demon. The man touched a lever on the machine in front of him, and another bone-chilling scream came from the creature. Slowly retreating, Usko made his way back towards the rocks where Jack and the others were waiting. "It's all a trick," Usko told them. "An illusion. The thing's not real." "Well, they're going through a hell of a lot of trouble to keep people away from here," Jack replied, watching as the demonic creature with its unnatural, awkward way of walking and gliding began going towards the nearest wolf. With its hair standing on end and its ears bent sharply back, the wolf snarled, but took a step backwards. Jack's brow furrowed as he watched the scene unfold. The hologram moved with eerie precision, its twisted form casting long, distorted shadows against the ruins. Even knowing that it was an illusion, there was something unnerving about the way it moved, as if the creature had stepped out of your worst nightmare. As the demonic projection advanced closer to the nearest wolf, Jack could see the wolf's indecision, its instincts telling it to fight, but its senses unable to reconcile the threat before it. What would happen if the wolf ran to it, Jack wondered. Of course, he'd run right through it, yet it seemed to have substance and shape, just like a real entity. The man behind the wall adjusted the controls again, and the hologram let out another piercing wail. The sound was so visceral, so bone-deep, that even Jack felt his chest tighten. Malachi, standing a short distance away from the ruins, let out a sharp bark, snapping his packmate out of its hesitation. The gray wolf snarled again, louder this time, and lunged forward. The illusion wavered slightly under the wolf's assault, its form distorting as the creature passed through it. But instead of dissipating, the hologram reformed almost instantly, as if mocking the attack. The wolf hesitated, its confusion palpable. "It's good," Julian muttered, watching the scene with a mixture of awe and unease. "Too good. It looks almost real, even when you know it's not." Jack's jaw tightened up. That's the point. It's meant to scare off anything that gets too close. But why? The grave robbers, still crouched low, seemed content to let the hologram do its work. There was no movements from any of them. They simply watched, waiting. "Whatever they're after, they're going through a lot of trouble to protect it," Jack whispered. Now Malachi's pack had now regrouped, the wolves circling the ruins again as if testing the demonic creature's boundaries. Malachi himself, larger and more confident than the others, moved with deliberate precision, his golden eyes searching for the source of the projection. "Malachi's trying to figure it out," Usko said, nodding toward the alpha wolf. Well hidden behind the crumbling stone walls, the man began sending sound out to every corner of the ruins, sound that seemed to swirl and jump from location to location, and at each sound, the wolves would turn sharply, their ears pricked and their bodies tense, their movements growing more agitated with every second. The sound wasn't random. It moved deliberately, calculated to disorient the wolves, jumping from one corner of the ruins to the next. A low growl echoed from one of the wolves, and even Malachi seemed unsettled. "He's using sound to throw him off," Jack whispered. Julian nodded grimly. "Malachi knows something wrong, but the rest of them..." He trailed off as one of the wolves lunged toward the direction of a phantom growl, snapping at thin air. The effort sent a wave of unease rippling through the pack. Jack's jaw tightened. They're getting frustrated. If the wolves lose focus, the whole thing could spiral. Usko, crouched a few feet away, narrowed his eyes at the man controlling the chaos. "We have to stop him." Suddenly, the wolves turned their heads in unison towards the trail leading up to the ruins. Small flickers of light appeared to be coming up the trail, floating about 4 feet off the ground. Malachi gave a soft bark, and the 4 wolves raced away from the ruins toward the small outcropping of rocks where O'Malley had told Jack to hide. "Okay, Now we get to see what role Father O'Malley is playing in all this charade, Jack whispered. I think it's time that we turn ourselves into wolves. Well, they're not going to get much more digging done tonight, Carl remarked, aiming his revolver towards the man maneuvering the levers on his equipment. The demonic apparition slipped behind a stone wall and was gone, the projector light now dark. Miguel and I will cover you. Jack, Julian, and Usko quietly slunk away from the rocks, crouched low to the ground and careful to keep cover. Father O'Malley and his group of followers were now clearly in sight, climbing up the trail, holding candles. A slight audible groan came from several of the men who had originally been digging and were now quietly gathering their implements and quickly walking towards the stone structure where the kneeling man was still crouching over his equipment. They put their shovels and their pickaxes behind the stone wall and began putting on long, dark, hooded robes. By the time that Father O'Malley and his followers were nearing the ruins, the former diggers were standing in a circle in the middle of the ruins in their dark cloaks, faces obscured from view by the large hoods. They were slowly rocking back and forth, chanting, while the kneeling man behind the stone wall began working his black magic. The wailing cries of the banshee began sounding at different locations throughout the cemetery. It was disorienting, the sound bouncing unpredictably from one side of the ruins over to the other. Several of Father O'Malley's followers stopped, glancing around nervously, while a few even turned and began running back towards the village. Father O'Malley's voice could be heard above the mournful cries of the banshee, calling out in prayer. The chanting of the circle of men in hooded cloaks grew louder, their words guttural and ancient as they performed their supposed ritual to summon the devil from the depths of hell. Meanwhile, behind the stone wall, the man operating the equipment adjusted his controls. Father O'Malley and his remaining followers were now only a few feet from the circle of cloaked figures. The priest raised his hand, signaling for silence, and the chanting momentarily ceased. Brothers and sisters, O'Malley intoned, his voice deep and resonant, carrying easily over the ruins. The time is upon us. Tonight, we awaken the power that lies beneath this sacred ground. Audible gasps sounded from the parishioners as they realized what Father O'Malley was saying. Shouldn't he be banishing this evil, sprinkling holy water over the ground, and calling on the power of the divine? Instead, his words were summoning the very thing they were fighting to banish. Several more of his followers turned and began running away from the circle of hooded figures, just as the priest himself moved towards the center of the circle, his candle flickering as he knelt and placed it on the ground before him. Standing tall, Father O'Malley raised his arms to the sky. Lord of the abyss, O'Malley intoned, hear our call. Awaken, grant us your strength. The time has come to shatter the veil between the worlds. A low rumble emanated from beneath the ground, faint at first, but growing stronger, like the distant roll of thunder. The chanting resumed, louder and more insistent. The few followers that remained began to back away. One woman dropped her candle and let out a scream as a dark figure appeared to emerge from the center of the circle, near where Father O'Malley was standing. The dark figure writhed and grew until it was standing tall over Father O'Malley. Arise, the priest cried as the figure loomed over him in its tall, spindly legs and misshapen body. A deep guttural roar erupted from the earth and sent the few remaining followers running for the trail. Their candles dropped in their haste to get away. Once the last of his entourage had fled, the father drew back his hood, and he laughed. Soon the other men in their dark black cloaks began removing their hoods and joining him in their laughter. That should scare them enough to get the hell out of town, O'Malley said, slapping one of the hooded men on the back. But we have one more loose end to clear up. I told those damn nosy tourists that have been snooping around here to hide up behind them rocks. I think it's time we lit that explosive off." A whistle from one of the hooded men alerted the one in charge of the holographic apparition to push the button on his remote, and within seconds, a blast that rocked the entire area was felt. Carl and Miguel ducked behind their rock hiding places as small bits of blasted rock rained down upon them. Several of the structures nearest the rock outcropping crumbled, and from out of the dust and the debris, 4 figures emerged. 4 massive gray wolves. Jack, Julian, and Usko also emerged from behind the rock they'd been hiding behind, and suddenly the hooded men found themselves surrounded by a large pack of wolves. Usko and Julian ran towards the man operating the equipment, while Jack, Malachi, and the others circled the men in the hoods. Jack wanted to confront O'Malley, but he knew Malachi also wanted that as badly as he did. Father O'Malley's smirk faltered as the pack of wolves closed in, their eyes glowing in the dim light, teeth bared in low, menacing growls. The laughter of the hooded men dissolved into uneasy silence as they became aware of the wolves advancing. "Stand your ground," O'Malley barked, his voice no longer carrying the confidence it had moments before. He reached for the crucifix at his belt, but the wolves didn't so much as flinch. Jack took a step forward, growling and snarling at the father. He watched as the father's features took on a hardened look and seemed to be changing. The father pulled his lips back, and 2 sharp canine fangs came down. He threw back his neck and rolled his shoulders as the bones in his body began to pop and snap as they elongated. He rolled his shoulders again, and fur began sprouting from face and hands. He threw his head back and let out a howl that made Jack's spine tingle. The men in the hoods stood back in awe as they watched the transformation of O'Malley take place. A few tried to walk away, but one of Malachi's wolf brothers snapped at him and kept him in the circle. Father O'Malley's face had changed into that of a wolf, and his upper torso had thickened, yet his body remained mostly human. The men in the dark cloaks watched in terror as the man standing before them completed his horrifying transformation. This was no hologram, no trick or illusion. Not this time. The father's face snarled with a feral intensity, saliva dripping from his elongated fangs as his glowing eyes scanned the circle. He stood taller than before, his thickened torso heaving with each breath. Jack froze for a moment as Malachi moved forward, growling low and steady, his fur bristling, his golden eyes locked on the father. Suddenly, Malachi launched himself at O'Malley, a blur of black fur and muscle. The two collided with a bone-jarring force. Claws slashing and teeth were snapping. The hooded men tried to flee, but the wolves quickly circled them, keeping them from fleeing, while the pack worked in perfect unison, driving the terrified men into a tight group. One of the wolves lunged at the hooded figure, snapping its teeth inches from the man's face, sending him stumbling backwards into the others. Meanwhile, the battle between O'Malley and Malachi raged on. The priest's claws swiped with deadly precision, but Malachi was relentless. He dodged a blow aimed at his throat, spinning to sink his teeth into O'Malley's arm. Jack helped keep him off balance by clamping his jaws around O'Malley's leg and dragging him to the ground. Usko and Julian had easily tackled the man with the equipment, knocking the remote from his hand. They held him on the ground while Miguel and Carl made it down from the hiding spot to the ruins in record time. They pulled the cables from the generator, and suddenly the wails and the demonic apparition vanished. Carl held his gun on the man, while Miguel tied his hands with one of the cables. After apprehending the man, Carl and Miguel walked him to the circle of men who were now surrounded by the wolves. Father O'Malley was on the ground with Malachi on top of his chest, holding him down. Miguel, tied his hands and his feet with more of the cables, while Malachi kept his position on top. The sound of sirens now replaced the sounds of the banshee's wail, and soon several police guard cars were parked at the base of the trail, with uniformed officers making their way up the path to the deserted village. The sound of the approaching helicopter grew louder, its searchlight slicing through the darkness as it circled the ruins, illuminating the scene below. Jack, Julian, and Usko quickly darted behind a collapsed stone building and transformed back into their human bodies, put their clothes back on before the officers arrived on the scene. Malachi still held O'Malley pinned beneath his weight. At the sight of the massive wolf, the first officer drew his gun, but Jack quickly calmed him, putting his hand on Malachi's head. "He's mine, officer, and so are these others. They're trained search and rescue dogs." Malachi lifted his massive head and licked Jack's hand a couple of times until the officer lowered his gun. "Who's in charge here?" the officer demanded. His voice was firm. "Oh, that would be us," Jack replied, trying to appear as composed as possible, despite all the chaos. "We've got your suspects rounded up." The officer's eyes flickered to the men in the large, dark cloaks, now huddled together and trembling under the watchful eye of the wolves. "And what about him?" He pointed to O'Malley, who lay bound and struggling against the cables, his snarls muffled by the weight of Malachi pressing down on him. "He's the ringleader," Jack replied. "You'll need more than regular cuffs to hold him, though. He's not exactly ordinary." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't question further. Instead, he barked orders to his team. "Secure these suspects and get animal control out here. Looks like we may have a wolf problem." "I'll take responsibility for the wolves," Jack responded. "Like I said, they are trained search and rescue dogs, and I'll be taking them home with me." "You won't be going anywhere, lad, not till we find out what's been going on out here," Officer O'Brien said. Malachi growled low, the sound that silenced any further comment from the officer. As the police began taking the hooded men into custody, Miguel and Carl handed over the equipment they'd confiscated. "You are going to want to take a close look at this," Miguel said. "It's what they were using to stage their little show." Jack turned to Malachi. "Let him up," he said, "but stay close." Malachi stepped back reluctantly, his eyes never leaving O'Malley as the officer moved in to lift the priest to his feet. As more guards arrived and the suspects were escorted down the mountain, the tense atmosphere began to shift. The flicker of flashlight beams danced across the rumbling stone wall as additional guards secured the area, and they began to catalog the scene. "What do you suppose they were digging up here?" Jack overheard one guard asking another. "Don't you know the legend of the lost gold?" the other replied. "There's supposed to be hordes of it buried up here. Men have been searching for it for years. Supposed to be quite a stash buried somewhere in the church as well, and maybe under some of the older homes in the village." Jack stood next to Malachi, his hand on the giant wolf's head. "How about I take these dogs home and then I'll meet you back at the station?" The officer gave Jack a cautious glance, his eyes flickering to the wolves that lingered beside him. "Hey, that'd probably be for the best. Don't think the lads would appreciate them tagging along in the cars," he smirked, though there was a nervous edge to it. Malachi let out a low rumble, and Jack patted his head, whispering, "Easy, big guy." The guard nodded again, already distracted by another officer calling for his attention near the ruins. On the walk back to the fisherman's cottage, Miguel turned to Jack. "Boy, that was quite a story O'Malley was spinning." Jack nodded his head in agreement. "I can't wait to hear what he has to say. He had me convinced he was trying to save this town, not ruin it." "I think he had a lot of people convinced of that," Julian replied. "There's still so many unanswered questions, though. Was he and his gang behind all this? I mean, the severed goat's head on our doorstep, the banshees in the window and scared the kids, and where's Fiona?" Jack wondered out loud. At the mention of Fiona's name, Malachi let out a low snarl. Jack reached over and patted his head. We'll find her, don't you worry. But let's get you home for now, and then I'll have someone drive you back to your house. The weight of the night lingered heavy in the air. The unanswered questions swirled in Jack's mind like a storm, and he knew that this was only the beginning of uncovering the truth.
Well, thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week as we read more of the Wolfman Chronicles. And until then, have a great week, everyone.